Okay, well, we have 3 presentations here, and I wasn't going to give all of them. I was going to get some help from other contributors from other parts of the state, but the weather and the distance kind of conspired against us. So I'm going to do all 3 of them, but the people who worked on them are online for questions. So I hope my voice holds out, because I don't think I've ever talked this long before. Some background information. This information is coming from Wisconsin Green Fire Voices for Conservation, a new organization formed to support the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management of its natural resources. One of our priorities is sharing knowledge about the relationship between cropping practice and water quality. To do that, we've gathered the expertise of water quality and public health scientists from DNR, university system, as well as agricultural conservation experience from Wisconsin Department of Ag and County Conservation Departments. And they're listed at the end of the handout if you want to see who those people are. We're all volunteers choosing to provide decision makers with the current science on the relationship between cropping practices and water quality. Our intent is to share this information with anyone in a position to influence policies related to agriculture and water quality. And as Gary said, while it's geared towards audiences around the state, we've tried to add a couple things relevant to Eau Claire County. But keep in mind, it is mainly a statewide talk. People here today have a wide range of backgrounds, from concerned citizens to certified crop consultants. Some of you were here for the previous presentations on public health and crop management, and some of you weren't. Our talks are going to start out pretty basic, but by the end, they're going to get pretty technical. So I hope you can follow them. And in terms of handling questions, if you have a brief question as I go through, you can ask it. But if you've got something that's going to take some more discussion, I'm going to encourage you to hold it to the end so that we stay on our timeline. Okay. Greg, got your slide? These are the take-home messages that we're going to talk about. That Wisconsin's got some water quality problems. Agriculture plays an important role as a source of a solution. Significant improvements are out there and possible. And there are some problems with Wisconsin's existing performance standards. Phosphorus is an element essential for all life in our bodies and in our food. It's a finite resource on the planet. It must be mined for agricultural purposes. It's estimated that the U.S. reserves will last about another 50 years, and then this country will rely on imports from the Western Sahara and Morocco. It's sometimes necessary to add phosphorus to agricultural lands for good production, but loss of even small amounts can have significant effects on water bodies. Water bodies are a function of their watershed. The water cycle connects them through surface runoff and groundwater flow. The priority of crop nutrient management has been meeting the needs of agriculture without wasteful over-application. Even when followed, it can still result in phosphorus loss to water bodies by surface runoff. Most phosphorus is transported to surface water during bigger runoff events, either attached to silt and clay or dissolved in runoff or drainage water. Climate change is predicted to cause more rain to fall in fewer larger events, which translate into more runoff potential. Phosphorus grows algae in surface water, which sometimes releases a toxin. In addition to aesthetic effects, there are human health effects associated with those toxins. You see them listed here, along with a copy of a warning sign that county public health departments are increasingly posting on Wisconsin waters. Algal toxins cause these symptoms in wild and domestic animals. Some animals have died. Algae blooms have also led to fish kills through oxygen depletion or dead zones and have been implicated in frog deformities. DNR data on aquatic life impairments shows that of the rivers and streams, 59% of them have been monitored. Of those, 19% were found impaired, and of those impairments, 67% of the time it was phosphorus. For impoundments, almost all have been monitored, 92%. 59% of them have been found impaired, and 91% of the time it's phosphorus. And lakes, 85% have been monitored. Impaired, about 33% of them, and 62% of the time is phosphorus.
What was your definition of an impoundment?
Mainly it's behind a dam.
Okay.
If there's a dam, a good-sized dam, it's an impoundment.
Okay.
While agriculture is important to Wisconsin's economy, so is tourism. Cost to society from algae problems includes health costs and water treatment costs at Lake Winnebago and Great Lakes cities. Study documented that 3 feet of water clarity in Wisconsin lakes is worth $20,000 to $30,000 in individual lakefront property value. A.W. Stout's study in City Menominee determined that if Lake Menominee were clean enough for recreation in the summer, the economic benefit from UW students remaining in town for the summer would be $2.6 million. Water-based tourism is significantly affected by public perceptions of water quality. The top 3 factors influencing people's choices of lakes to visit were safety from contamination, water clarity, and lack of odor. These water quality considerations outweighed factors relating to fish and wildlife. And now we'll move on to the role of agriculture. Go ahead. Majority of waters listed by DNR as phosphorus or sediment impaired are either due to non-point sources, which is runoff, alone or combined with municipal and industrial point sources. Since 1995, Wisconsin point sources reduced phosphorus discharges to the Mississippi River by 23% and Michigan by 27%. This slide summarizes all the phosphorus sources flowing down the Wisconsin River. Agricultural non-point sources are in brown, and they're important because of the large acreage that they cover in the basin versus urban and residential areas, which include septic systems, and those areas are in pink, the 2 pink shades. The background concentrations are in green, and the point sources are in purple. And you can see as you go downstream, you have more of it because the watershed is getting bigger. These trends in agriculture do not bode well for improving water quality. The Wisconsin average soil test phosphorus for cropland, an indicator of soluble phosphorus stored in the soil, increased for decades and remains high. The average soil erosion rate has been increasing since the 1990s. Phosphorus moves with the soil. The size of farms is increasing while the number of farms decrease. This is in response to market demands to produce more food on less land at lower costs. 3% of Wisconsin farms produce 40% of Wisconsin milk. A 1,000 cow dairy herd produces a quantity of waste equivalent to the city of Stevens Point, or about 25,000 people.
And what time frame is that?
Well, it's continual. You could, whether you measure it on a daily or an annual, you know, whatever, it's just the quantity that comes out. 1,000 animal units.
Equivalent to which city?
Stevens Point.
Going back to that one slide where you had the watershed, is that the only one that was marked? Just
we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is the most sophisticated one that's been done. The ones previous were less sophisticated, and we'll touch on what this means for the Eau Claire later. Okay? Let's see. Pie chart. There we go. Most phosphorus applied in Wisconsin is chemical fertilizer. It's important to note that there's plenty of Wisconsin cropland available for application of manure. Wider distribution of manure would reduce the import of phosphorus into the state. Concentrating manure in smaller areas of Wisconsin complicates the task of keeping phosphorus loss low in those areas. Hauling costs incentivize application of crop above the crop need in some settings, and set the stage for serious environmental problems. Parts of the state without local manure supplies must import chemical phosphorus. Wisconsin has minimum agricultural performance standards. You've heard about these. In this talk, we're talking about the two in white. But it's important to recognize the entire list. These practices cost money to implement and can reduce farm income. While the performance standards apply to all farms, enforcement only occurs in some categories. And you've heard about this already, so I'm not going to talk much, but it's just reinforcing that applies to everyone, but enforcement is limited. And a reminder that the estimate is about 37% of the farms in the state prepare nutrient management plans. Okay. Nutrient management plan includes routine soil testing and fertilizer rate recommendations, plus runoff phosphorus and erosion loss estimators. These additions make nutrient management plans more expensive than a typical soil test report. Contained within a nutrient management plan is a phosphorus index. And it estimates the average phosphorus delivered from a field to a stream given long-term weather patterns. It evaluates alternative management practices. The text in black is a list of the factors that go into the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index, or WPI, that's outside the control of the farmers, and the white text are controllable factors. Together, they determine the amount of phosphorus lost to surface water. Included in the statewide expectations was an individual field maximum phosphorus index of 6 as an average over a crop rotation, which is a 2 to 8 year sequence of crops that will be repeated on a field, and 12 as in an individual year maximum. These goals were intended to be a starting point for management and not an end point applicable everywhere. A statewide limit of a WPI of 6 can be compared to a statewide speed limit of 70, unacceptable to exceed anywhere. The need for lower WPI values in sensitive watersheds was recognized in the 2010 rule package. They were called targeted performance standards and must be passed into law before they can apply. So why did the effort on phosphorus stop here in 2010? Well, in 2010, the statewide phosphorus water quality standard was just being established. The ability to relate the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index to water quality standard didn't exist. There was very little information about the distribution of these WPI values around the state, and most farms didn't have a nutrient management plan and therefore had no speedometer. In 2018, we have more farms with nutrient management plans or speedometers, more efforts to collate WPI values in watersheds to understand their distribution, and we have now successful efforts to use the WPI to target practices. The red areas on these maps illustrate the distribution of fields with WPI values over 6 in 3 watersheds. You can see that they're a small percent of the watershed area. In this watershed, fields over 6 are 3% of the area, but they're 12% of the load. These would be a great place to start, but work on lower WPI fields is also necessary if water quality is to be protected.
Where is that?
This one is Ulaho Creek, which is over by the Great Lakes. So now we'll get on to our third subject. Given that enforcing the statewide maximum of WPI 6 is unlikely to remove impairments, what can be done? Pleasant Valley is an example of an appropriate use of the WPI in a watershed where stream monitoring documented the results. This kind of study is complicated, expensive, and rarely done. In this case, it was a 10-year study of 2 adjacent watersheds. The cropland that was above 6 was 14% of the area, but it was 39% of the phosphorus load. The average phosphorus index there was 4.2. They found some pastures with very high phosphorus. And the treatment that they applied included work on cropland plus some pasture and barnyard work. There were no manure structures in the watershed. And most importantly, they targeted working with farmers on fields with phosphorus indexes over 3.
Pleasant Valley, the township in our county, or?
No, this is down towards Madison.
Okay.
These are the results. 2/3 of the fields above 3 participated. It was a voluntary program. Importantly, the total phosphorus loss decreased 50% more in the treatment watershed than in the control watershed. Farmers converting to no-till, which was the main thing that went on there on the cropland, if they converted above 3, they often did likewise on fields below 3 just because it was simpler. And some complicating factors in this one during the 10-year period, the CRP acres decreased by almost 20%, and animal units declined by 34%. These would tend to throw the study off, but that's why they use the control watershed, because those demographics were happening in both nearby watersheds while the practices were all going in one. And that's what makes these studies so hard to do and expensive. My last topic is improvement of the ability to develop locally appropriate WPI values. In 2018, the science has developed to identify WPI values for individual watersheds. Go ahead. The Wisconsin River TMDL Total Maximum Daily Load Study is the most recent of its kind and the first ever to include not only watershed-specific phosphorus reduction needs to deal with the impaired waters, which are the red waters on this map, but it also included mechanisms to apply those needs to nutrient management plans. And it covers a large portion of agricultural land in the state of Wisconsin. It individually analyzed 337 watersheds, and they're called subbasins on this map. And has identified where the phosphorus is coming from, looking at both agricultural runoff and municipal and industrial point sources. And you can see the distribution there, darker colors means more phosphorus. In the Wisconsin River Basin, we now know what it will take each watershed to meet water quality needs downstream. These are watershed average values, not individual field maximums. And that complicates putting any of this into law. However, they can be used as goals in voluntary efforts similar to Pleasant Valley. What does this mean for Eau Claire County? Well, a similar study was done on the Eau Claire River watershed. And while it wasn't able to set watershed-specific WPI goals, it did determine watershed-specific percent reduction goals that identify the need for lower phosphorus levels. The question is, can these numbers be achieved in agriculture? The details of how this is done is coming from the experience of visionary farmers. Procedures and experts in methods for profitably farming at low PI values are available. They include practices like cover crops that were not emphasized in the Pleasant Valley project. And then we've got finishing with some conclusions, which is kind of a reiteration of what we started with, that Wisconsin has some water quality problems. Agriculture plays an important role. Significant improvements are possible using established BMPs, and the existing performance standards for phosphorus don't adequately protect water quality and need to be updated with better science. And we've got some recommendations. Encourage proper use of nutrient management plans. Emphasize the importance of a WPI goal less than 6. Work with WPI developers to add farm-wide average numbers to the SNAP Plus model. This will enable a farmer to compare their overall trends with what the watershed is looking for. Right now, everything is individual field numbers. And that's not what the model, that's not the language the models talk in, the watershed model. Go ahead. And that's what I have. We can take some questions now while I catch my breath a little bit here.
Are there areas in the state that have high phosphorus levels? Like my farm, I bought it in 84. And when I tested it, I met with the agronomist and he made up a fertilizer and everything next. I have only put on 2 pounds of available phosphorus farm a year, not on all fields. And my phosphorus tests have come back since 84. The same or greater.
Well, if the trend in your soil test P is upward, then your losses will be increasing in all likelihood, unless you've got some practices that you put on that keep the soil in place. So, I mean, that's what the SNAP Plus model does, is, okay, if your phosphorus level goes up, you can compensate with that with some practices. And I'm not an expert on how it works, but just because your soil P level goes up doesn't necessarily mean the phosphorus loss goes up.
What I'm saying is I'm not adding anything. I'm adding a minimal amount of phosphorus.
Yeah, I don't have an explanation for that. That would be a crop consultant question.
If I may, Dr. Vitale with the UW Eau Claire, she's the hydrogeologist, and she's studying water and bedrock within the region. We do have regions within this part of the state which have naturally high phosphorus in the soil and in the bedrock. Phosphorus can be also high within the groundwater because of the naturally occurring bedrock and soil phosphorus. And some of that phosphorus with the groundwater is feeding into surface waters. There are regions in this part of the state that are naturally high.
We did some studies over in the Red Cedar Basin, and on the eastern side of the river, the groundwater phosphorus levels are higher than on the western side of the river because of the difference in what's in the bedrock. So that is a factor.
I'd like to comment on the slide where you talked about hauling manure around the state, so we had to use less dry phosphorus fertilizers. Well, that's a good idea. The problem with that is logistics. It's expensive to haul manure anywhere. You know, you have to have the right trucks, and it's just financially, it'd be tough to make that one fly. Especially here where we don't have that size of facilities in general.
That's very true. And to the extent that we shut down small dairy farms in some part of the state and ship them over to places where there's already lots of animals, you know, that compounds that. You know, if you look back to when dairy farms were spread all over the place, so was the manure. As you concentrate things like, especially like Brown County, they're running out of places to put the manure. It just can't do it anymore. So I'm thinking more on a really large scale. But you're right, that's a big factor.
On the slide, when you said the 2010 situation, most farms didn't have a nutrient management plan. In 2018, they do. What kind of percentages are you talking? That's kind of vague.
Well, yeah, it's 37% now by the state agriculture's estimate. And over the last few years, I mean, just like 2 years ago, it was 32%. So, I mean, it's going up. As to what it was back in 2010, I don't have that number. And there's a bunch of it that goes on that isn't in that number. It's my understanding, I mean, those are the farms that the Department of Ag is aware of doing nutrient management plans. If somebody is doing it outside the government support system, that wouldn't be in the numbers. So those numbers are certainly underestimated. To what extent they're an underestimate, nobody really knows. They're the only estimate out there. So it's flawed, and it's all we have.
Are there any questions from anyone listening remotely? We move on.